Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for our program today, Nonprofit Development Now, where we have senior philanthropic leaders providing advice for fundraising in the current climate. And current climate could mean a lot of different things, but as we all know, we're coming up on what we're hoping is the conclusion of the COVID-19 pandemic, or at least the most serious part of the pandemic over the past 12 months. So we're really excited. It's a rare treat to have so many philanthropic thought leaders and executives in a meeting at the table at the same time. So we're really grateful for that. We really appreciate the time and effort of all the panelists that we have here today. And really quickly, I'll introduce them, and I'm not going to get into too much detail on their bios because they're everybody on this list. The reputation precedes them, and they're community leaders, and so we're sure you've heard of all of them. First, we have Brenda Sare, President and CEO of the Alfred Group. Hi, Brenda.
Hi.
Gillian Darlow, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Koch brothers Foundation. We have our very own Rochelle Jervis, President and CEO of Executive Service Corps. Sean Garrett, who is the President and CEO of United Way of Metro Chicago. And we have Sean Jeffers, Executive Director of Little City Foundation. And we have Shelley Davis, CEO of the Coltman Foundation. Thank you all for joining us today. We really look forward to your insights on some of the questions that we have that we hope will provide some great guidance for our audience and for the clients of our audience. We really look forward to your input there. And with that, we'll jump right in. My first question is I'd like to go to Gillian first. And that is, we know that foundation support can help legitimize smaller community-based organizations to corporate donors and other individual donors. And so we'd like to ask, what are some ways that foundations can promote who their grantees are? And what are some ways that you recommend that grantees share who supports and promotes them?
Sure, thanks. And good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you all this morning, especially on this sort of notable anniversary that we were talking about earlier in the call. This is something that we hear from some of our grantees, that Polk Brothers was the first organization and that supported them, and that support helped them get other support. And I'm sure that's the case with other funders as well, that they've been in that position. And I guess it's not surprising, because with new organizations or smaller ones, someone needs to take the first leap. And foundations are in sort of our business. We're supposed to take more risks and do that. I thought it might be helpful first to just talk about how we promote it generally, and then some more specific ideas too. So foundations do have communications plans. And it's different than a sort of typical PR or marketing where you're trying to market the organization that you're with. Instead, we are trying to market the issues that we talk about. Market's the wrong word, but promote, generate awareness of the issues that we talk about in the organizations that we support. So we do that through social media, press releases, e-newsletters. We have a whole sort of host of different means that we do that in. And we are talking about the rounds of grants we make, but also often highlighting specific organizations. Some organizations also publish annual reports, and that's another place where they're promoting their support for organizations. Another thing that we do is that grantees, you all have your own communications, and we try to re-promote it. So if you put it out there, we will often retweet it or share it or get it out there. And especially if it has a link in it. It's very hard for us to reshare a press release or a newsletter as much as something that has a link. But then if it has a link, we can put it out in our communications, our social media, and all of that kind of stuff. The more direct way that we can help promote our grantees is often funders host roundtables. And this is a way where we can invite our colleagues and our peers, either at other foundations or also corporate donors, not as often individual donors, but we invite our peers to come together to learn about different issues that we care about and that we think either they do care about or that they might care about. And those typically will highlight 1 to 3 organizations, usually on a particular topic. They're not generally pitch sessions. Unless an organization, a foundation decides to be more explicit about the sort of direct ask of that meeting. Usually they're more about the issue, but of course, if you're getting highlighted in front of a lot of foundations and funders, that's going to generate a lot of awareness, and people will start thinking about whether or not it makes sense to, whether or not there's a good match between what they do and what you do. And then the last thing I would say is, if you have a particularly good relationship with a funder, ask them to help you, especially if you can be targeted about that. Say that you want connections to specific funders, foundations or corporations. Ask for an introduction. The community's pretty networked, and most people know most people. And so if a funder really, especially if they're your first funder, they want to get behind you. They want you to be successful. And so ask them to make some of those introductions for you.
You know, I think right before we started here, I think it was Sean Jeffers who said in this universe, it's the success is when we're talking about we, you know, in terms of leadership in nonprofit world, as opposed to talking about myself or I. So it sounds like keeping that communication going, not being bashful about reaching out to those foundations for support on introductions is really key. Shelley, would love to hear your perspective on the same question. You know, what are some ways that as a foundation you promote who your grantees are, and what kind of advice do you also have for them?
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. So I'll speak from 2 perspectives. So I'm the new CEO of the Coleman Foundation. I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing, but then I will switch back to my previous role at the Forest Preserve Foundation, which was an operating foundation, and tell you a little bit of the tips and tricks we learned there, which might be complementary to what Gillian said. So the Coleman Foundation also has a really good history and track record of being the first one in the door for some of our grantees. We haven't had a long history in terms of strategic communications, and that's one of the things that I want to make sure that we do better at, which means that we sometimes end up being the lone sole funder of particular projects, which makes the grantee more vulnerable. So that's one of the things that we're really working on. We started working on it already through doing what we're calling an impact report series, where we are really highlighting our work, trying to build our list, trying to do better spotlighting of our grantees, building a social media calendar and platform. So all the levers that Gillian is talking about, we are implementing and also moving more into those funder collaborative tables. So that's from the Coleman Foundation perspective. I think from the Forest Preserve Foundation perspective, where I just came from, which is a very small startup nonprofit, we were working on the suggestions that Gillian named, right? So sometimes we were having convenings or gatherings that we would call together, but then build host committees and ambassador committees that could influence other folks to come. So that was another way, and then ask folks to help promote. So really, asking for support and advice through promotions and showing up before asking for money or while at the same time asking for money. So that was another way of doing what we really called friend-raising, that is complementary to fundraising.
Interesting. So friend raising, that's I haven't heard that one before, but that's it's a very unique proposition. So, and building brand awareness is a huge part of that. Sounds like a big part of that effort.
Exactly. Yeah, especially for up in a small organization, that was really important.
Interesting. Well, I think that kind of that issue kind of that concept kind of transitions to our next question for Brenda, and this is a concern I think many of us have whenever there's some kind of noteworthy shock to society, whether it be pandemic, whether it be an increased heightened awareness on social justice, and that is this past year with COVID. The pandemic has really inspired a lot of one-time support from foundations and individuals. I'm sure everybody on this call and in this meeting has probably made contributions to organizations they may not normally have made contributions to, simply because of what we were seeing in our communities and where we saw needs. And so for many of the nonprofits that survive the pandemic or some other shock like this, there's always a fear that a second wave of closures or staffing cuts might become a reality when the so-called donor fatigue sets in. And so, Brenda, we'd like to hear from you. What kind of donor trends or giving trends really should nonprofits be prepared for?
Thank you. First of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking time out to join us in this conversation. I'd like to first speak to donor fatigue. I spent the bulk of my career with the American Red Cross, and you're absolutely right. Whenever there's large scale fundraising, so my world revolved around disaster fundraising, and then the question of, so how are our donors going to continue to give when they have given? And we've had years on the disaster fundraising side where we had back-to-back disasters. And I just want to say, just as a development professional and a consultant who worked with organizations across the country, I would just say that, organizations that really kind of push through what I'm going to call a donor fatigue myth, and they're out there, creating solid relationships with their donors, continuing to elevate the impact and the compelling needs of their community and what they are doing to solve and be in partnership with their communities. These organizations are seeing stable growth and they're growing and they're doing fine. It's really interesting when we take a look at what did happen in 2020 and what we're seeing as we continue throughout 2021. We saw that smaller gifts of $250 or less rose by 19%. And in the fundraising world, that's significant because for a number of years, we experienced a decline in household giving. So even though, the data isn't out yet for 2020, we are seeing some really encouraging signs of continued involvement from donors to support organizations. So we saw gifts of $250 or less up by 19%, major gifts up by 6%, 88% of major donors are still willing and able to give. 70% of donors surveyed indicated that they're willing to give the same amount. 20% are expected to give more. One indicator that we looked at is the Giving Tuesday in December. Tremendous. So from individual donors, foundations, donor advised funds, they were the sweetheart of 2020. They saved the day. So for even Giving Tuesday in 2020, we saw an estimated nearly $2.5 billion. That's a 25% increase over 2019. And so we continue to remain encouraged. You have many of our foundation leaders on around the room, and I just want to say thank you because for many of our organizations, you were the lifelines. You were there first. In addition to corporations who continue to look for ways to not only support through in-kind, but also through the strength of their employee engagement opportunities. And of course, individuals who are leaning in to support organizations who are continuing to do great work and understanding that their dollars are needed now more than ever. So I'm very optimistic about what we're going to see in 2021. And I would just say to, all of our fellow development professionals and marketing professionals on the phone, keep doing what you're doing. Stay in front of your donors. Utilize all of the various platforms for communications. We know that some donors and generations respond to different vehicles. We also understand that engagement is different now that we're around the Zoom room. So use video, use your email, use what I'm calling, go back to the old school, write letters. So again, we're just saying some of those old school ways are now becoming the new school ways of now keeping our donors engaged. So even though there's a lot going on right now, I would just say with the markets continuing to be strong, which is very different from what we experienced in 2008 and 2009, we're very encouraged about increased giving and the opportunity to engage a wider and more diverse donor individuals to create even more generosity for our organizations across the country.
So that's very interesting. So it seems like from your perspective, you're projecting this to be a more durable kind of continued growth in fundraising and engagement. And I was glad that you suggested some of your tips on what nonprofits should be doing to continue that right over the past year. If I could just touch upon one of those things, I'm curious. Over the past year, what's maybe the top one or two new ways of engagement that you would recommend that all nonprofits, if they haven't adopted them yet, what would you recommend? We're going a little off book here, but top one or two things that you're seeing that were new last year that you would encourage people to continue doing, this year and post-pandemic.
It all goes back to, and Sean talked about this sense of we, that we're in it together. And being on this digital platform, I am so proud of our sector. It turned itself on the head and it innovated and it pivoted. And some of the things that we saw our clients do that was met with success was doing just what we're doing now, is bringing their donors together, bringing their partners together to do briefings, to show here's what we are doing. So using this platform, and it's much easier to get people nowadays because most people aren't flying all over the place and they're in one place and they're willing to get onto a Zoom, social time or a Zoom briefing to learn more about what your organization is doing and how their dollars are making an impact. The other thing, I was just on with doing interviews with a philanthropist yesterday, and I was asking, I'm like, what are you paying attention to in terms of messaging from organizations right now? He said, there's so much on email right now. My mailbox gets really full, but if there's a really short link that I could just click on to hear from somebody, a live person, from the CEO or the recipient or a program person talking about what they are doing and how they are pivoting and continuing to serve the organization, I'm much more likely to click on that link than maybe to read a really long document. So again, I would just encourage our colleagues in the field, make use of the technology because your donors are becoming more and more sophisticated. And because of them just being bombarded with lots of messaging right now, just really elevating your message. Use the voice of your CEO, use the voice of your volunteer leaders, because again, your donors are looking for that connection. So make it dynamic.
That's good advice, I think, in any industry. So
yes.
Very much appreciated, Brenda. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about equity within nonprofit leadership. And this issue actually is something that has been discussed very much in the public markets more recently as well, about how when you have startups that might have a more diverse representation in their leadership over time, as they keep growing, they get more venture funding, and then they end up some of these companies end up going public. The representation of a diverse community within those organizations' leadership kind of diminishes over time. And so we've noticed that in the foundation world, the number of Black, brown, female executive directors tend to go down, on average, as nonprofits get larger, they continue growing and they become more financially successful. And so, question for you, Sean Garrett, how can foundations help maintain representative leadership as organizations continue to grow?
Right. Well, let me preface this by saying I'm a white male answering this question, so there's some inherent challenges with that, and so hopefully my answer gets better a year from now, 2 years from now, and there's a constant learning process for us. The way we look at it at United Way is to try to understand what are the leverage points we have, and how are we using those leverage points to change the equation. And one is like, so we make conversations like this where we say, hey, this is what our perception is, but we aren't publishing that information. We aren't talking about it in concrete terms, and we aren't setting goals on it. So, this year, as an example for us, we're late in this conversation. We set that as a baseline. So for all of our organizations that we fund a lot, we had a baseline of representation and leadership at both the staff and board level. And in subsequent years, we're going to have very clear goals of what that makeup will look like. And, that will be one of the determinants. It's not the only determinant, but it's one of the determinants that we will look at in terms of funding. And, that's a choice for all foundations to look at. But if we want to change that, we have to be clear about what it is that we're trying to change. And funding is a really important way to do it. The other part that we on the funding side of it look at is, we are a large funder of human services, and we're such a tiny piece of the overall puzzle. And so how are we using our relationships? And so Gillian talked about some of the partnerships within the foundation community. We explicitly look in the corporate community because that's where our deeper relationships are. And how are we having these conversations? And, think about over the last summer, every single company, frankly, the US, if not the world, made statements about their commitments to equity and what that looks like. So how do we make sure that we're connecting those dots for them on their philanthropic work? And it's by making clear and making visible, has been invisible for so long, which is this, very different setup for leadership of larger or more established organizations versus smaller organizations. And so how are we creating those partnerships directly with organizations? So that's one kind of leverage point we try to use. The second is around boards. Organizations grow, the boards play a more significant role in choosing a type of leadership and who is in those seats. And so what are we doing to make sure that board members know this or aware of it or are part of it? And so we've had tracks that we've used on that. One is we've explicitly started talking with boards, that organizations that we fund, about how they pay their employees and ensuring that they're paying their employees. And it's hard to do, right? To say you have to pay your employees more, but why is it that some of the most important grassroots organizations in our community are paid at levels that are significantly different than the work that they're deserving of? And so we've been starting to have those conversations with boards. Likewise, we set up a board training program, actually at the very beginning of the pandemic. We've now done 3 cohorts of it to try to bring more diverse board members on community boards so that the board members themselves are representations of the community. A lot of work to do there, but there's a great interest in the corporate community. Again, that's where our leverage point is, and the corporate community of placing people on boards. And so how do we use that to be able to change it? And then the last part I'd say is, a lot of people get hired in positions as organizations grow through search firms. So how are we leveraging the relationships with search firms? I get called by a different search firm every day for input on whatever job. And I might not have any idea of the job, but if I'm only giving them a list of 4 white guys, those are the 4 white guys they're hearing about. And so how are we making sure that we're always providing a diverse slate to search firms for calling us? And we've been very intentional about creating relationships with search firms, and then very intentional with our partners to make sure that when we're having conversations with search firms around it, that we are saying very explicitly that as a funder of agency X, Y, and Z, we expect them to have a diverse slate. And ultimately their board's going to make that decision, but we have the ability as a funder to say to search firms, who can then more delicately or directly, depending upon as needed, say that to the boards, that's the important consideration. And the more we change it so that it is something that is seen as a benefit for fundraising, the more often boards will be making those types of decisions. And so, I hope we'll have a different conversation in a few years, but we're trying to be very explicit about it right now.
And I'd like to just one follow up to that. I think, for majority of us on this call, we're all based in Chicago, right? And in Chicago, while it's a very diverse community, right, and any organization, whether nonprofit or corporate, if you're looking at a slate of candidates, you can say we want to make sure we have a diverse slate of candidates that we're considering, without having any diminishing effect on qualifications, skill set, all of that, right? I'm curious if you interface with some of your counterparts in other markets, right? So maybe more rural markets, outside of the major metro areas of the country. So let's say Missouri chapter or other chapters. Do you kind of hear the same kind of commitments that you've described from those chapters, or I know, at least in my practice, sometimes you hear that when you get into a rural community or less of a diverse community overall, there are more challenges in making sure we're able to meet those benchmarks that we're setting for. Curious if you've had any conversations with those kind of.
Yeah, so I'll from this lens. So I've been in Chicago about 2.5 years now, here before, but in between, spent some time leading the United Way in Charlotte. And Charlotte's not a rural community by any means, but we had a more broad geographic spread that included, urban Charlotte, suburban Charlotte, and then some of the rural components of our community. Very candidly, the conversation was more advanced in Charlotte than it is in Chicago. And I think sometimes that, the language and other components of the conversation is more advanced here. It's a much more diverse city, but the practical execution of that is different. And in Charlotte, we were having much more explicit conversations, much more kind of tangible goals on leadership in communities than I see in Chicago over the last couple of years. And so I think, at some point that changes when you get to, particularly when we were talking about our more rural cases in North Carolina, it's just a very different makeup. So it was a different conversation. But if I look at Charlotte as a whole, the 20th largest city in America, and compare it to Chicago, I would not say that that Charlotte is in a lesser position. In fact, I would say that they've been much more intentional over the last 5 or 6 years in terms of not just having the conversation, but practically implementing steps that have resulted in different levels of leadership throughout the community. And it doesn't solve all problems. I mean, Charlotte's struggling with so many of the same things, but I do think it's important for us to look around every once in a while and say, yeah, we've done some good things, but there are others that are doing it well. And how are we going to learn from them and incorporate that?
Very encouraging. Shelley, same question to you. Would love to hear, kind of what your perspective has been in your various roles on how foundations and other, similar organizations can help maintain representative leadership as they grow in particular.
Yeah, I think that we could do a better job in foundations about what the true biases and barriers are, quite frankly. We look at the search firms for executive recruitment for high-level positions. They have very few senior leaders that are actually leading those searches. We look at the guidelines of foundations, and I think we're getting better about asking those questions, but I think we should be honest about, even when we're asking the questions about diversity, is it data collection or is it really a decision-making point of data that could really, where an organization could be, quite frankly, punished or receive less support? And conversely, what are the proactive steps we're actually doing to make sure leaders of color are supported wholly and fully? So there's a funders collaborative called AMPT, and I don't know if AMPT is an acronym or not. And okay, so Gillian, I'm looking at Gillian, she says no. So it's a new effort that's really about helping leaders of color in South and West Side organizations to grow and to have more capacity. When I was just on my first call, and there have been other calls, but my first call a couple of weeks ago, and I looked at the list of groups that have been funded, and these leaders of color have been doing the work forever. They are not intentionally small. They don't have the relationships, or donors aren't taking the true risk to actually fund them in a way that makes them bigger, you know? So I just think that we just need to be really honest about what's going on with our sector in a way that that truly prevents leaders of color to stay for the long term because they personally can't afford it, or because they're burned out because the barriers are just too high. And I just think that we also need to be really serious about funding leaders of color aggressively if we want them to grow. So I was on a funder training on funders and racial equity yesterday. That was a national call. People that have been doing this work forever. And I'm going to get this quote completely wrong, but a leader said something like, fund us as if you want us to win. And I just thought that was huge, right? Because it's true, like the pittance that leaders of color get in comparison to white leaders for maybe doing the same work or work from a different vantage point is kind of ridiculous. And I just think that there's a lot of data out there at this point, that's national data and local data, about the discounting effect that leaders of color get. So why should they stay? You know, and again, there are some organizations out there that are intentionally small. They have a passion project, but those that really do this as a career and a vocation, as a living, really, they need to grow, and they need to be competitive, and donors need to be investing in them significantly.
So I think, yeah, the takeaway is we need to make sure we make a focused, intentional effort on supporting those leaders. And I think this is really a microcosm of what's happening, or what's needed rather in, the balance of the market, even outside the nonprofit foundation world. Very much appreciated on that insight. Talking about organizations as they grow, Rochelle, I'd love to hear from you on this. What are some ways that foundations and other nonprofits can support the creation of succession plans, or help backfill support infrastructure to keep them going as they scale up and continue their growth?
Thank you for that question, and thank you all for participating in this panel. I'm learning a lot. One of the unique things about ESC is that we provide interim leadership for organizations. So many organizations, their succession plans involve engaging us to provide interim leadership in the short term, while we or another search firm conduct a search for a permanent leader to the organization. And obviously that is a low cost proposal that they don't have to invest in advance. So you might have a leader that you're confident is going to be there till retirement, but they might need to take leave for some reason, for health reasons, for family reasons, for whatever. So having a plan where you can bring in an interim doesn't require you to spend any money now. You can just call when you actually need one. One of the things that I have noticed in terms of scaling is since COVID, in the past, when people brought ESC in to support a specific area of operations, it would be because they were growing. But what we've seen lately is, because of staff layoffs and closures and budget issues and challenges recruiting staff, we're seeing that we're being brought in and engaged to fill roles where people were laid off. So, for example, we had a client we started with last week where we have a team doing their outreach for them, and they had laid off a marketing director. after not being able to make payroll and having to make some pretty significant cuts and refinance their building assets and so on. And so our team is providing support and doing tasks that were done by a staff member, and when they get financially stable again in the future will be done by a staff member again, so it's a gap stop. And so that is a change that has happened with some of the economic changes for sure. I think, you know, it's really hard when you are investing a lot of time and energy in maintaining your organization and trying to keep all of the plates spinning, to think about what happens if I get the flu, what happens if a key member of the team leaves. It's a very tricky thing to think about, and requires us to kind of think of the organization as a separate entity to ourselves. But it's critically important. And so, you know, I would just encourage organizations, whether they engage ESC in helping with that, or they're volunteers or recruiting volunteers, to just think through what you would do. And if you're in a smaller organization in terms of staff, to make sure that's communicated clearly and agreed upon by your board chair. And as your board chairperson changes, that is re-communicated and agreed upon, so that if something comes up, you're not the organization doesn't face irreparable damage in a gap situation.
Sean, Garrett, you know, would kind of love to hear if you have any additional thoughts on you know, succession planning and backfilling support infrastructure.
Yeah, build off of really what Shelley was talking about, where this is a question of pay equity. As I look at it, is, you know, we have some unbelievably remarkable and accomplished leaders all around neighborhoods throughout the city who are doing just incredible work, and we are counting on for the viability and success of our city. Right, they're doing everything from ensuring that infrastructure exists to development projects to vaccine rollout, and they are being paid at a rate that is significantly below what others who are doing, you know, very important work, but significantly below it. And then we're asking the question, well, what are we going to do about succession planning? Like, we're just lucky that these folks are staying in jobs, period. And the people who are working for them are working equally hard and paid even less. And then when it comes to hiring their replacement, we're saying they don't have the experience, they don't have, you know, we have to have an honest conversation about what does it cost to accomplish what we want to accomplish as a community, and what is the appropriate pay for folks that are doing this work. And if you do that, and if we are providing those foundations, if we are able to put money into leadership, it allows for them to hire people who can work with them, who can help support them, who help avoid the burnout, but then are also able to be in position to take this forward. And, you know, we look at this, and, you know, we're struggling with this in a lot of neighborhoods right now, where some of these incredible neighborhood leaders do not have the kind of infrastructure behind them that they need to be successful. And they're taking it all on themselves. And it is really a burden, and it's hurting them personally, it's hurting their efforts. And we have to work with board. You know, this is a conversation I'm having later today with the board, is if we're serious about this, you're gonna have to spend more money on staff, because otherwise we're going to lose months when person X, Y, and Z says, I'm done with this and I'm going to go do something else. And then we're going to months trying to find the replacement. We're going to lose all the momentum, and, you know, all those great things that we can do, you know, won't be there when instead we pay more money for the leader, we pay more money for their staff. And then when that leader does move on, all leaders would do and should, their staff is ready to pick it up, and they're ready to keep moving the work forward. And so, you know, for me, it's a lot easier said than done, but I do think we have to have a much more intentional conversation about pay and pay equity to ensure that folks that are leading some of the most important work in our community are adequately paid, and therefore their staffs can be adequately paid, so that that succession planning is not just something that's put on paper, but it's something that can actually be executed.
Right. So yeah, making sure we focus on pay equity, and I also imagine a lot of these teams are typically lean by nature anyway, right? So everybody is busy rolling with the punches, and it sometimes takes some effort to take a step back and say, okay, so if somebody leaves, what are we going to do next, right? And having that succession planning, which usually comes in the form of some type of strategic planning. So Very interesting insight there. Well, we've next question here is for Sean Jeffers, and Sean has been quoted a couple times already this morning, but we haven't we haven't heard from him directly. So I'd like to pose this to you, Sean. For years, nonprofits have been told to merge and collaborate for a variety of reasons. And so the question is, are there ways that individuals who want to form new nonprofits in spaces where organizations may already exist can be referred to those existing organizations for the purpose of helping them expand and continue succeeding in their mission?
Upneat, like I think the people before me, very appreciative of this opportunity. It's mind-blowing to me just to listen to the insights from so many talented and knowledgeable people. I thought about this question in advance, and I have to admit, Upneat, that my answer changed after listening to something that Shelley shared by way of where smaller agencies are, just getting out the gate, nonprofits, and where we fail to make investments. Prior to her comments, I would have really pushed the idea of mergers and more strategic collaborations as the way we must go. But what that represents is that the big become bigger. And I think we've got to find a way to make sure that those entities for which we want to see foster and grow have a way to grow that does not lose or take away the value and the culture that they were promoting. And so I struggle with that because I was, I was more of a, there's minnows and whales, and so the whales will swallow the minnows and the world will be a better place. And I'm not so sure about that. But the challenge with mergers, and I've been on this this bandwagon for quite some years. About 6 years ago, we did merge with another nonprofit, so I got that merger aspect in my blood, and it was beneficial. It was a smaller agency. In many ways, it was more of an acquisition than a merger, but we both ended up better as a result of it. As we've gone out and talked to other entities, I began to see how difficult it is to plant the seeds for merger. And a number of variables get in the way, and unless there's truly an embrace internal driver, in some instances where the exec is about to leave, they're a little bit more open to, but getting people to buy in, even though we started with there are some advantages to merger, it's not real clear. If the goals are to reduce inefficiency and increase capacity, it's tough for people to see. I think particularly in our nonprofit world, the quantitative differences between organizations are very difficult to distinguish. I met with a potential merger partner and had her mission and my mission side by side in writing. And I made the comment that, we basically do the same thing. She pointed to a word that was different in her mission statement to say, no, we don't. Instead of looking at, conceptually we do. So there is this particularly in the nonprofit space, the absence of quantifiable measures which illustrate the importance and the benefit of merger. And so particularly for that newly created entity that has all the passion, the culture, the desire to be subsumed within a larger organization really isn't appealing. So I do think particularly to our foundation leaders, they have to help us pick where and when are the right moments for those mergers and collaborations to take place. How do you incentivize our boards of directors very equally see it more from what we described as my organization versus do we create greater value by joining somewhere else? So I think we've got to help people see that what they value most will not be lost by coming together in a more structured and organized way, that it can help us address liability concerns, viability concerns, and survivability concerns. And we're in an environment now where finite resources for infinite need, these foundations cannot come up with enough money to fix all of the inequities. And so I think the climate is very ripe for us to begin to talk about, are there some ways that we can come together without losing our culture, without losing our brand identity, without losing that which makes us special, and hopefully create a better value equation for the causes we're willing to die for, basically.
It sounds like, I mean, threading the needle on finding the right merger partner or acquisition target in the nonprofit world is such a, there's so many variables that need to be delicately balanced, and so really appreciate hearing that. You know, it's not just an easy wholesale kind of you know, method to adopt growth, right? It's something that needs to be very intentional and very you know, particular from an organization, and ensuring that missions and people are aligned. Rochelle, I'd like to ask you the same question. You know, kind of being exposed to a broad spectrum of organizations that you may have, you know, seen merge or have advised on you know, potential merger candidates. What are some resources that individuals can really look to identify existing organizations that they can help continue growing?
The Executive Service Corps' position is not that there are too many organizations or that there isn't enough available support for them, or that they're inherently wasteful. That we do believe that sustaining the existing organizations is significantly more efficient than allowing our community institutions that are providing vital support to close and then having to start from the ground up to rebuild them. But if you think of an example of a small community garden, it doesn't get better and by having it be part of a massive conglomerate, right? It's really about that community and that specific role. So when we think about efficiency and supporting efficiency so that there are more resources for programmatic efforts and for fairly compensating team members so that they can be retained, we think about what can we do in terms of the sort of structural things around efficiency. So can we move to having staff telecommute or use co-working spaces instead of spending money on a large office? Can we move to using back office support for payroll, for accounting, for HR, for other administration? Can our clients join the back office collaborative and save money on office supplies? What things can we do in that space that are about us joining forces and partnering, that are not really about having to merge? Because I do think, the research shows that larger organizations are not represented by communities as well as smaller organizations are. And so there is something that can be lost with an actual structural merger. But partnerships and collaborations are key, and thinking about those things are also important. And then I would just say, if you're an individual who has this great idea for a nonprofit or a program for a nonprofit, I would highly recommend that you go to organizations and that care about that and that mission align with that, and you talk to them, because so much of the work I've done at the Executive Service Corps and at previous organizations that I've led, like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, have been volunteers saying, I think we should have this, or I see a need for that, and us just building a new program. There were so many resources and community things that were built out of people's willingness to lead those projects that would not have happened otherwise. Grief counseling for children being an example. So your idea matters, but you don't necessarily need to spend the money to start a new nonprofit. You can use the strength of a nonprofit that aligns with your goals to help them do their work better, and to be able to help and contribute in a way that matters to you too. When my daughter passed, everyone assumed I would start a charity in her honor. And I was very strongly of the mind that there were so many great charities that had helped her in her life, that using that support to support them and help make them sustainable was a much more efficient way of remembering her. So I don't just tell that to other people. It's something that I've done myself, and I found to be a fulfilling thing.
Interesting perspective, Rochelle. Thank you for sharing that. And this conversation about whether someone should start a new organization or merge really dovetails into our next topic, next question. And Sean Jeffers, it sounds like you've given a lot of thought to this. I'd like to pose this to you. Nonprofits many times are told that they should be operating more like businesses, which implies that decisions should be more based on bottom line and not necessarily impact or mission driven. And obviously this isn't a logical argument for many reasons, and the obvious ones being that nonprofit leaders are usually paid much less than their for-profit counterparts. Organizations and their supporters and all of their employees are typically more mission driven as opposed to simply looking for the highest paycheck. They're in many ways held to a much higher standard, reliant on goodwill of others to exist as opposed to revenue for product or whatever other service your organization might sell. And these organizations are typically governed by a volunteer board. And when we think about those things, you start thinking on the other side of the token, it seems like for-profit businesses would probably benefit more from acting like nonprofits. And this is no secret, right? Because of all the emphasis on ESG, right, and making sure governance of public companies is more representative of their communities as well. So and more mission oriented. I think it's something that's becoming more of an accepted norm within the business community as well. I guess in your view, in what ways do foundations combat this unfair expectations from their corporate partners and the community on this idea or notion that they should be run more like?
It was, I could just say from what you just said, yes. I mean, you gave all of the drivers and the challenges, and what I've heard it for many, many years about being more and more like a business. And sometimes I have come to believe that there's almost this belief and what I'll just call isomorphisms, that as long as you look like, act like, but not actually be, it's okay. So what we've seen in our industry is some folks have adapted the names of business, whether or not it's president, CEOs, they've adapted the titles of business in a number of ways. We've looked at sizes of offices and a host of things, all to mirror. If we're looking at now, particularly in this pandemic, I'll argue that businesses have acted more like nonprofits during the pandemic. They've had to deal with uncertainty in ways that we've had to deal with it. They've had to deal with the challenges of maybe repositioning their staff, looking at their products in a different way. So I think the actions of nonprofit have helped businesses bold exceptionally well right now. What we need from our foundation friends is that recognition that you have to invest in your infrastructure. You have to invest in the people, their wages, their benefits, their opportunities for career growth. You have to invest in technology. We have to invest in marketing. You have to help us deliver on the promises of creating value. So I do think that there's this concern about the overhead. What is the contribution to margin? Even my organization itself touts that we're only spending 13 cents on the dollar for overhead. Is that the right number? If I spent 10 cents, would that be better if I spent, 25 cents? And so I do think the foundations, if we're looking at the logic models that lead to creating the value that we deem necessary, we've got to understand that quality does cost, and that making those investments in infrastructure, much like a business would, if a business wants to expand either deeper or farther, it's going to make investments. And with nonprofits, that becomes something that gets kind of frowned upon. I've had, unfortunately, in the past, foundations that have looked at our size and said we're too big for their help. I've had foundations that looked at our 990 and said your salaries are too high to get our help. And so those biases come in that I think really drives us to know what is that right number and what can foundations help promote that allows people to know that investments in capacity and infrastructure can result in more positive and greater outcomes and sustainable outcomes as an organization moves forward.
Sean, have you seen those biases come about more recently, or has it been kind of a consistent, in your career, a consistent challenge you've had to kind of hear about and face from?
It's been a consistent challenge. I do want to share a very bright moment, and it's not because Shelley's on the line, but early in the pandemic, we got a call from Clark McLean. And he called wanting to speak with myself, my CFO, and my chief development officer to ask us about our early experience with the pandemic. And we shared from the cash flow concerns and shutting down programs and the like. And immediately he made the comment, we can't do all that you need, but we're going to do something. And so that put aside all of the other things and recognized the complexity of running a business in a pandemic environment. And so I do think, I'm hoping that as we come out of the pandemic, our business models have changed. I had another foundation that we were speaking with who recognized that our deliverables from the past 12 months were impossible. People couldn't come to our program. And so as we look into the next 12 months, it's uncertain. And so if if the grant is going to be based on that deliverable, I'm already sunk. And so I do think that we've got to look to what do we need to, from a foundation perspective, what can you give to help people ramp back up before you hold them responsible for what it is that they should deliver? We're already coming out of this in a hole that we've got to come out of first before we can get back to the place where we were delivering the best outcomes that we had deemed possible.
Interesting, Sean, and that's a very timely concern and question, right? As we were talking as we first started about how we're, really at that 1-year anniversary of the day we were all told to the extent we could, in our careers, be told to work from home, stay at home, and what we've noticed over the past year is, the businesses, and at least in the for-profit side of the world, the ones that had the most liquidity, the most access to capital, that could kind of float the months where everything was closed, they were able to thrive. And it puts sort of everybody else, right? Like you're saying, if people can't attend your programs, then there's no production, and what do you show? It's almost like your shareholders, right, are the foundations and other donors that you look to. So that's a challenge that I hope there will be a greater focus on coming in the coming months, especially as we're coming out of this pandemic, and organizations like yours are going to need that support. Gillian, I'd like to come to you with the same question and what your perspective has been. Do you find that your corporate partners and donors kind of share that same bias that Sean had described?
So there's, this question gives me so many thoughts, and I know we're at the hour, so I'll try not to go on too long. The whole idea that nonprofits need to act more like businesses, I think there's an issue at the premise level, and then there's thoughts for nonprofits and the details of that. But the premise is wrong. The nonprofits are businesses. It's just a different business model, and with different types of revenue. And I think that's something that the entire sector, nonprofits, funders, and anyone really that cares about nonprofits needs to. It's a constant battle. It's been a long battle, right? We've been working on that forever to try to change that approach, but it is really important. And to remind people that, nonprofits, in my opinion, honestly, are the most entrepreneurial people. This is what Sean was talking about, right? That resources are thin, and nonprofits learn how to do things without very many resources in an incredibly creative way. And what we've been seeing, and you just mentioned this, is that businesses are really having to be more like nonprofits now. And I would add, in addition to their operations, I think the racial reckoning that started in the summer is causing businesses to have to think about their social impact in a different way. their impact on people, their impact on systems, and how they've contributed. And they're having to do it with authenticity. And the ones that aren't thinking about that sort of double bottom line are being called out for it, frankly, already, and will struggle and be unstable. So I think the more we can sort of point to that, and the fact that the way nonprofits operate actually is a model in some ways for businesses, I think that can start to strengthen the idea. As a funder, what we're, when I said the details, I think all of that is not to say that nonprofits can't be paying attention to how they operate. So as a funder, what we look for at Polk Brothers is that organizations understand their financials, are able to look at their cash flows, have the right financial controls and human resources practices and things like that, that are the internal systems that are going to be necessary to their survival and to their strengthening. So we're not looking to impose structures that aren't just about that organization becoming stronger. And I think that is, I see that more and more in other funders. There's a push toward more emphasis on general operating. A number of years ago, we used to have, so Polk Brothers used to have a cap on administrative expenses of 15%. And we took that out and said, we're going to try to make more general operating grants, and where we make program grants, all of your program costs can be included. So that's the, whether it's the van or the rent or the whatever that can be associated with your program, that can be built in. And that's not just us. There's a lot more funders that are doing that kind of work. So it's a trend that that sort of a focus on real costs that a lot of funders were talking about before the pandemic. I would say, because of other things calling people's attention, there's not as much conversation on that, but it is language funders know, and I think that people should be pointing to. And the last thing I'll say is that I think we should stop calling it overhead, because really, it's not overhead. Overhead makes it sound extra, like it's not needed. It's this extra stuff, over here. And it's actually the core costs of an organization. You would never try to operate your home without the plumbing. That's probably a terrible metaphor, but you know what I mean? Like those unsexy things that are essential to the organization, and that it can't exist without. So I think we need to, there's certainly a lot of education in that, but I think we need to change the language too.
I think that's right, Gillian, and I think all of us on this call will agree that plumbing is fundamental, right? It's not an excess, and it's not an extra. And this really brings us to the conclusion of our conversation this morning. This has been truly an inspiring hour. Hearing the insights on kind of how organizations like those that our panelists lead have evolved over this past year, not only in reaction to the pandemic, but also just the general trends of where we are, in 2021 now, and so it's really interesting to hear. It's really interesting to hear what the evolution has been, and so conversations like this are, of course, the catalyst to change, and I hope. I think things, what Sean Jeffers was just talking about before about how this bias, and what Gillian just said too, we need to change these terms. We can't use the term overhead, which kind of has like a negative excess connotation to it, to describe what our fundamental, core of our organizations are. And I really think that's really an inspiring thing to hear, and this is where that change starts. And just really quickly, I know we're basically at the end here. A week ago, I was actually participating in a commercial real estate panel, so obviously much different subject matter, a little bit different of an audience. And the one common thread that existed between these two panels is we were talking a lot about the events following George Floyd's death, and kind of what that had on the commercial real estate industry, especially in Chicago and other major markets. And we had some commercial lenders on our panel, attorneys, other folks. And the one key takeaway was that putting aside all the legal ramifications of what happens and what happens with property insurance, and if anybody on the call wants to talk about that, they can contact me about that. I'd be happy to share my views. But the one takeaway was the community as a whole, and community means the people that were protesting, the people that worked in retail, the shop owners, the landlords that owned the shopping centers. They were all united in coming back together and reopening and making sure that they weren't just reopening on their own terms, but they were reopening with the ideas and thoughts of what the protesters were sharing. And so it was really the takeaway for all of us was that there's a resiliency in that community. And so I'd like to just leave everybody with that message of hope that this conversation is a catalyst amongst this community that's on this call. But I think that message of resiliency, the power of we, is emanating amongst our broader community, even outside the nonprofit and foundation world. So I leave you with that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning, and thank you again to all of our panelists. We know that you have really demanding schedules, and your schedules are most demanding because of the missions that you're pursuing and that you're leading. So we're Executive Service Corps. We're really pleased to have you and appreciate your time.